The train groaned, a weary iron beast surrendering to the incline. Its brakes hissed a long, final sigh that seemed to freeze in the thin mountain air, hanging in a white plume against a sky the color of slate. The door of the passenger car slid open with a shudder, and Mary stepped down onto the rough-hewn planks of the platform. She clutched the handle of a single, battered trunk, her knuckles white and raw from the cold that had seeped through the carriage walls for 3 days. She wore a wedding dress. It was not a grand affair of silk and lace, but a simple cotton garment, sewn with more hope than skill. The fabric was thin, meant for a church in a warmer, kinder place. Not for a rail stop perched on the spine of the world where winter had already claimed the land. A bitter wind whipped down from the snow-dusted peaks, slicing through the dress as if it were not there, raising a rash of goose flesh on her arms and the back of her neck. She had no coat. The man who had arranged her passage had said one would be provided, along with everything else a bride would need. The train hissed again, impatient. A conductor leaned out, his face a mask of indifference. He did not look at her. No one did. She was just another piece of freight being offloaded at a place that was not a town, but merely a point on a map where the railroad paused for breath. With a lurch and a deafening clang of steel, the train began to move, pulling away from the platform, its rhythmic clatter shrinking into the vast, silent landscape until it was gone. And then, the silence that remained was absolute. It was a cold, heavy thing that pressed in on her, amplifying the sound of her own shivering. She stood alone. The station was little more than a shed, its windows dark. A curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, the only sign of life. A few other buildings huddled nearby, low and dark against the snow, looking as if they had grown from the frozen earth itself. She scanned the horizon, the empty road that wound down into the valley, searching for a wagon, a horse, a man, anyone. The arrangement had been clear. Mr. Theron Hobbs would be here to collect his bride. An hour passed. The sun, a pale, distant wafer in the sky, did little to warm her. Her feet, clad in thin leather shoes, had lost all feeling. Her fingers were stiff and useless. She tried tucking them into her sleeves, but the cold was relentless. Men emerged from a building that looked like a saloon, their faces whiskered and hard. They glanced at her, a flicker of curiosity in their eyes, then looked away, pulling their collars tighter as they trudged through the dirty snow. They saw a woman in a wedding dress, alone and freezing, and chose to see nothing at all. She was not their business. In this part of the country, a person's troubles were their own. Finally, the door to the station creaked open and a stooped, elderly man appeared. He had a broom in his hand but seemed to have no intention of using it. He squinted at her, his eyes watery from the wind. "You the one for Hobbs?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. Mary nodded, unable to form words. Her jaw was trembling too hard. Hope, a fragile, foolish thing, fluttered in her chest. The station master grunted, a sound of grim finality. "He ain't comin'." "But he wrote," she managed, the words catching in her throat. "The letter said today." The man spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near the edge of the platform. "Hobbs was run out of town a week ago. Owed money to near everyone. Got caught with his hand in the mining company's lockbox. They gave him an hour to clear out before they strung him up. You're lucky you missed him. He was a cruel sort, even for these parts." The hope in her chest died, turning to a familiar, cold stone. Sold, shipped, and now abandoned. The station master looked her up and down, taking in the thin dress, the shaking limbs. He offered no pity, only a shrug that spoke of a world weary of other people's misfortunes. "Nothing for you here," he said, and turned to go back inside. "Wait," Mary called out, her voice thin against the wind. "Please, is there somewhere I can stay? A boarding house?" He paused at the door. "Got money?" She shook her head. Every penny she had ever saved had gone to the man who had brokered the marriage. The station master gave another shrug, this one more final than the last. Then you best get walking. Next town's a 2-day ride, if the pass ain't snowed in. Which it likely is by now. He disappeared inside, the heavy door thudding shut, leaving her once more in the suffocating silence. Mary did not cry. The tears would only freeze on her cheeks. She did not beg. She had learned long ago that begging only earned you contempt. She was an orphan, the daughter of a servant, passed from one house to another like a piece of worn furniture. She had been taught to be silent, to be invisible, to expect nothing. Rejection was the one constant in her life. This was no different. It was only colder. She sank down onto her trunk, the wood hard and unforgiving beneath her. She drew her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, trying to conserve what little warmth she had left. The wind was getting stronger, carrying with it the first sharp needles of snow. It tore at the pins in her hair, pulling strands loose to whip across her face. She closed her eyes, focusing on the simple act of breathing in and out. She would not die here. She had survived worse than this. She had survived hunger and beatings, and the quiet, creeping despair of being utterly unwanted. Cold was just another hardship to be endured. From a ridge overlooking the station, a man on horseback watched her. He sat motionless, a dark silhouette against the darkening sky. He was tall in the saddle, with broad shoulders and a straightness to his back that seemed out of place in this land of stooped and weathered men. His coat was dusty, his hat pulled low, but the way he held himself spoke of a different world, a place of discipline and refinement. His horse, a powerful black stallion, shifted restlessly beneath him, its breath pluming in the frigid air. He watched the bride on the platform, a small, white figure slowly being consumed by the vast, gray landscape. He saw her talk to the station master, saw the man's dismissive shrug, saw her sink onto her trunk, a portrait of absolute desolation. He felt a flicker of something, a dull ache in a part of him he thought had long since died. It was the ghost of a memory, of another woman, another loss. He squeezed his eyes shut, pushing it back down into the darkness where it belonged. He had come to these mountains to escape such feelings, to live a life as barren as the peaks around him. This was not his concern. He had learned, the hard way, the cost of involvement. With a soft click of his tongue, he turned the stallion and rode away, disappearing over the rise without a sound. Night fell not with a gentle fade, but like a heavy curtain dropping. The temperature plummeted. The snow, which had been a light dusting, began to fall in thick, heavy flakes, driven by a howling wind that shrieked through the gaps in the platform boards. Mary could no longer feel her own body. She was a vessel of pure, agonizing cold. Her thoughts grew slow and syrupy, her memories blurring into a gray fog. She knew she had to move, to find shelter, any shelter, but her limbs would not obey. With the last of her strength, she fumbled with the latch on her trunk. It was empty, save for a few threadbare undergarments and a Bible her mother had given her. It was not much, but it was a box. It was a shield, however flimsy, against the wind. She managed to heave the lid open and curl herself inside, pulling her dress and her knees in as tightly as she could. She rested her head on the worn wood, the scent of cedar and mothballs filling her senses. The world outside the trunk became a muffled roar. The darkness was complete. She thought of her mother, a woman she barely remembered, and whispered a prayer into the cold air. Then, she knew no more. The next thing she knew was a feeling of movement. She was being lifted. Strong arms were around her, one beneath her knees, the other supporting her back. She was impossibly heavy, a dead weight, yet she was being carried as if she were a child. A rough wool blanket was wrapped around her, shielding her face from the stinging snow. She tried to open her eyes, but her lids were frozen shut. She heard the crunch of boots in deep snow and the soft snort of a horse. A deep voice, low and calm, murmured something to the animal. There were no other words. She drifted in and out of consciousness. There were flashes of awareness, disconnected moments of sensation, the warmth of a horse's flank against her back, the steady, rhythmic sway of its gait, the feeling of being held secure in a saddle by a firm, unyielding arm, and through it all, the overwhelming presence of another person, a silent, powerful force that had pulled her back from the edge of a frozen oblivion. When she finally woke for good, it was to the sound of a crackling fire. Warmth enveloped her, a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to be thawing her from the inside out. She was lying on a narrow bed, a simple cot with a straw-stuffed mattress, but she was buried under a mountain of thick wool blankets and what felt like a heavy animal pelt. Her thin wedding dress was gone. In its place, she wore a man's flannel shirt, ridiculously large on her, but soft and warm against her skin. She opened her eyes slowly. She was in a small, one-room cabin. The walls were made of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss. The air smelled of pine, wood smoke, and brewing coffee. A fire blazed in a stone hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center, and shelves holding tins and supplies lined one wall. It was a Spartan, masculine space, but it was clean and, above all, warm. A man stood with his back to her, tending to a pot over the fire. It was the stranger from the ridge. She recognized the breadth of his shoulders, the confident set of his posture. He moved with a quiet efficiency, stirring the contents of the pot without a wasted motion. He was still wearing the dusty coat and trousers of a cowboy, but now she could see the details that had been indistinct from a distance. The leather of his boots was old but of a superior quality, cared for and polished despite the harsh conditions. The buttons on the cuffs of his shirt seemed to be made of polished silver. He seemed to sense she was awake. Without turning, he spoke. His voice was low and carried a resonance that seemed at odds with the rough cabin. "There is broth on the hearth. You should eat." He ladled some of the steaming liquid into a tin cup and brought it to her. He did not meet her eyes, instead focusing on the task of placing the cup safely in her hands. His own hands were large and calloused, the knuckles scarred, but his movements were surprisingly gentle. Mary wrapped her trembling fingers around the warm tin. The heat was a shock, a welcome pain that signaled the return of life. She took a sip. It was a simple rabbit broth, but it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. It spread through her, chasing away the last of the deep, internal chill. She drank it all, her gaze fixed on the man who had saved her. He had moved back to the fire and was staring into the flames, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Mary struggled to sit up, the blankets pooling around her waist. "My name is Mary." He turned his head slightly, his profile outlined by the firelight. He had a strong jaw, a straight nose, and a mouth set in a firm, unsmiling line. There were faint scars on his cheek and temple, pale lines against his weathered skin. His eyes, in the flickering light, seemed dark and deep, holding a sorrow she recognized. "Eli," he said, just the one word. "Eli," she repeated softly. "Are you a ranch hand?" A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, or irony, touched his lips for a brief second before vanishing. "Something like that." His answer was a dismissal, a clear signal that he would not be answering questions. Mary fell silent again, finishing her broth. The warmth was making her feel stronger, but it was also bringing a sharp awareness of her situation. She was alone, in a remote cabin, with a silent stranger who had undressed her and put her in his bed. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of her relief. Yet, looking at him, she did not feel threatened. He kept a deliberate distance, his posture closed and defensive, as if he were the one who needed protection. She put the empty cup on the small crate that served as a nightstand. I should not have. I'm a burden. If you could just point me toward the nearest town. I will be on my way. He finally turned to face her fully. His gaze was direct, and for the first time she felt the full weight of his attention. It was unnerving. His eyes were not just dark, they were old, filled with a weariness that had nothing to do with age. Look outside, he said. Mary pushed aside the pelt covering the cabin's single window. Her breath caught in her throat. The world was gone. Buried under a thick, seamless blanket of white, snow was piled high against the cabin walls, obscuring the bottom half of the window. Beyond it, more snow was falling, a swirling, impenetrable curtain that erased the sky, the mountains, and any hint of a path. The storm had not passed. It had settled in, locking them away from the world. The passes will be closed for weeks, Eli stated, his tone flat and matter-of-fact. Maybe longer. No one is getting in or out. The reality of her situation crashed down on her. Trapped. She was trapped here with this silent, mysterious man. She turned back to him, her eyes wide. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. She thought of her trunk, her dress, her few meager possessions. My trunk. It is by the door. I brought it with you. She saw it then, tucked in a corner, dusted with snow. He had thought to bring it. He had thought to save not just her, but the last remnants of her life. The small act of consideration chipped away at her fear. She pulled the blankets tighter around herself, a gesture of both modesty and defense. I cannot take your bed. It is the only one, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. That night, Mary lay in the cot, pretending to sleep. Through her eyelashes, she watched Eli. He ate his own meal of stew standing by the fire, then methodically cleaned the pot and utensils. He checked the latch on the door and wedged a thick piece of wood against it. He laid out a bedroll for himself on the floor, not near the warmth of the fire, but directly in front of the door, placing himself between her and the entrance. As a final act before blowing out the single lantern, he laid a large, heavy pistol on the floor beside his head, its dark metal gleaming in the last of the firelight. He was not just giving her the bed, he was guarding her, but from what, or from whom, she could not guess. Lying in the darkness, listening to the howl of the wind and the steady, quiet breathing of the man on the floor. Mary felt a confusing mixture of terror and a profound, unfamiliar sense of safety. She was a prisoner of the storm, but for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel entirely alone. The silence in the cabin was deep, but it was a shared silence, and in the heart of the brutal, unforgiving wilderness. That was enough. The days that followed were measured not in hours, but in the rhythms of the storm and the silent habits of the man who had saved her. The wind howled a ceaseless, mournful song around the cabin's eaves, and the snow fell in a disorienting, endless cascade of white. The world outside their small shelter was a formless, violent blur. Inside, a quiet routine took root, a fragile truce with the wilderness and with each other. Eli was a man of profound and deliberate silence. He rose before the first hint of gray light, moving with a ghost's quietness to stoke the embers of the fire back to life. He would venture out into the storm for short periods. Returning with firewood he had somehow cut and stacked before the blizzard's worst, or with a snared rabbit, his face rimed with ice, his expression as impassive as the frozen landscape. He never spoke of where he went or what he did. He simply provided. In his absences, Mary began to explore her small world. It was an exploration born not of idle curiosity, but of a desperate need to understand the man who held her life in his hands. She did not pry, but she was a woman who had spent her life observing the habits of her masters from the shadows. She knew how to read the language of objects, how to piece together a life from the things a person kept. On a high shelf, tucked behind tins of beans and flour, she found the books. There were only 3. One was a worn volume of Shakespeare's tragedies. Another was bound in dark, cracked leather, its title stamped in faded gold leaf, De Re Medica. The text was dense, inscrutable Latin. The third was a book of poetry, its pages filled with elegant, sloping script in a language she did not recognize. A simple ranch hand would not own such books. He would likely not even be able to read them. In a wooden crate beneath his cot, she discovered the medical supplies. She had been searching for a spare needle to mend a tear in the flannel shirt she wore when she lifted the lid. Inside, she saw not just homespun remedies, but things she had never seen before. There were small glass vials filled with dark liquids, carefully labeled with the same precise script from the poetry book. There were gleaming steel instruments of frightening complexity, fine-boned forceps and sharp, slender scalpels wrapped in oilcloth. There were rolls of clean, white bandages and a small, corked bottle that gave off a sharp, clean scent that reminded her of a hospital she had been in once as a child. This was not a trapper's first aid kit. This was the collection of a surgeon. The whiskey bottles were the most blatant contradiction. They were not the cheap, rot-gut sort she had seen in the saloons of her past. They were elegant, dark green glass, with labels that spoke of France and vineyards she could not pronounce. He drank from one sometimes, late at night. A single measure poured into his tin cup. He would sit by the fire, the whiskey untouched for an hour, as if its presence alone were a comfort. He drank not like a man seeking drunkenness, but like a man trying to forget a specific and terrible memory. And then there were the maps, rolled tightly and stored in a leather tube. They were not crude drawings of local territories. They were detailed geological surveys of mountain ranges she had never heard of, their peaks and valleys marked with notations in that same foreign, flowing script. One map was not of mountains at all, but of a coastline, a place of bays and harbors a world away from this landlocked prison of snow. Mary took in these details, these fragments of a hidden life, and stored them away in the quiet corners of her mind. She suspected Eli was a liar, that the simple name and the dusty coat were a costume, but she also understood that his secrets were his own, and that they were likely heavy and sharp-edged. She had her own secrets, her own pains she did not wish to share. So she said nothing. She accepted the broth he offered, mended the shirt, and kept her thoughts to herself. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer the heavy, awkward silence of strangers, but a shared quiet, a space they inhabited together. It was broken by small, necessary questions. Is there more wood? The water pail is low. Slowly, tentatively, these questions blossomed into something more. It began with her. One evening, as she sat by the fire sewing a new patch onto the knee of his trousers from a piece of discarded burlap, he watched her, his usual stoic mask softened by the firelight. "You are skilled with a needle," he said. It was not a question, but a simple observation. Yet it was the most personal thing he had ever said to her. Mary did not look up from her work. My mother was a seamstress for a wealthy family. She taught me. It was all she had to give. He was quiet for a long time. "Where is she now?" "She died of a fever when I was 7, Mary said, her voice even, betraying none of the old, familiar ache. "After that, I was passed around. A distant cousin of the family took me in, then the parish, then another family who needed a scullery maid. I was never family. I was just a pair of hands." She finished her stitch and finally looked at him. He was listening with an unnerving stillness, his dark eyes fixed on her. He was not just hearing her words, he was absorbing them. She felt an unfamiliar urge to continue, to unburden herself to this silent, watchful man. "They are all the same, those houses," she murmured, her gaze drifting into the flames. "Cold, in their own way. There is the cold of hunger, when you are forgotten at supper time. There is the cold of the attic room where you sleep, and there is the cold of a man's hand, when he takes what he wants and leaves you feeling like you are nothing but a thing to be used." She stopped, horrified at what she had revealed. She had never spoken of these things to anyone. It was a shame to be carried in silence, a stain on her worth. She expected him to turn away in disgust, or to offer some hollow, useless platitude. Instead, he simply said, "I know." And in those two words, she heard not pity, but a profound and sorrowful understanding. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he, too, had known a different kind of cold, a different kind of loss. The next night, it was his turn. He was cleaning his rifle, his large hands moving with an expert, practiced grace over the steel and wood. Mary was kneading a small lump of dough for the morning's bread. "The scars on your face," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She had wanted to ask since she first saw them, "Were you in a fight?" His hand stilled. He stared down at the rifle in his lap as if seeing it for the first time. The silence stretched, and she was sure he would ignore her, retreating back behind his wall. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, choked with a pain that was still raw. "It was a fire, in New York." He paused, taking a slow, ragged breath. "I lost my wife, and my son, he was 5. Mary's hands stopped their kneading. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy with the weight of his grief. "I tried to get to his room," Eli continued, his voice a low monotone, as if he were reciting a story that had happened to someone else. "The stairs were gone. The roof, it came down. A burning beam caught me across the back." He gestured vaguely over his shoulder. "I was a doctor. I knew about skin grafts, the theory of them. I never imagined I would be the subject." He fell silent. He did not need to say more. The fire had taken everything from him, leaving him with nothing but scars. Inside and out, it explained the whiskey, the sorrow in his eyes, the flight to this desolate corner of the world. He was not just hiding his identity. He was hiding from a life that no longer existed. They did not speak of it again, but something had shifted between them. The final barrier of silence had been breached. A fragile, unspoken warmth began to grow in the space between their shared sorrows. It was a bond forged not of words, but of quiet, mutual care. Mary began to cook their meals with a renewed purpose, turning their meager supplies of flour, dried beans, and rabbit meat into savory stews and warm bread. She tended the fire, stitched his worn shirts, and brought a semblance of order to the small cabin. These were the tasks of a servant, but she did them now not out of obligation, but out of a deeper, more complicated feeling. She was caring for him. He, in turn, cared for her. He was a relentless provider. He braved the biting wind each day to chop wood, stacking it high against the cabin wall. He fashioned ingenious traps from willow branches and twine, never failing to bring back something for the pot. One afternoon, he took her worn-out shoes, the thin soles cracked and broken, and worked for hours with a piece of leather from his saddlebag and an awl, meticulously stitching a new, sturdy sole onto them. He handed them back to her without a word, his face impassive, but his eyes held a flicker of something she could not name. One afternoon, the storm abated for a few hours. A watery sun appeared, casting a brilliant, blinding glare across the endless sea of snow. Mary stepped outside for the first time in over a week, her eyes watering at the sudden brightness. The air was so cold it felt sharp in her lungs. She stood on the small patch of ground Eli had shoveled clear by the door, brushing accumulated snow from her skirt. He came to stand beside her, his presence a solid, reassuring warmth in the frigid air. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the snow sparkle on the branches of the pine trees. Mary stood a little too close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. A gust of wind blew a strand of her hair across her cheek. Before she could raise a hand to brush it away, he did it for her. He lifted his hand, the one covered by a thick leather glove, and with an impossible gentleness, his fingers brushed the stray lock of hair from her skin, tucking it behind her ear. His touch was brief, fleeting, But it sent a jolt through her that was more powerful than the cold. It was a gesture of profound and startling intimacy. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. His eyes met hers, and, for a heart-stopping second, she saw the walls come down. She saw not the stoic stranger or the grieving doctor, but a man, lonely and raw. The air crackled between them. He leaned in slightly, his gaze dropping to her lips. And then, just as quickly, the mask slammed back into place. He straightened up, his jaw tight, his eyes once again distant and unreadable. He took a half-step back, breaking the connection. Without a word, he turned and walked away, grabbing his axe and heading for the woodpile, his back rigid and uncompromising. Mary stood frozen, her cheek tingling where he had touched her. The rejection was a physical blow, sharper than the wind, colder than the snow. He had saved her life. He had shown her kindness, but he did not want her. She was a responsibility, a piece of cargo he was stuck with until the thaw. Nothing more. That night, she cried. She lay in the cot, turned toward the wall, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs. The tears were hot on her cold cheeks. It was not the abandonment at the station or the memory of past cruelties that made her weep. It was the pain of this new rejection, of being so close to a moment of genuine human connection, only to have it snatched away. For one foolish, fleeting moment, she had allowed herself to hope. She wanted, just once in her life, to be wanted. Not just saved, not just cared for, but truly, deeply wanted. In the deepest hour of the night, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers and the wind had died to a low whisper, a sound came from outside, a loud, insistent knock on the cabin door. Instantly, Eli was awake. He moved with a silent, fluid speed that was startling, rising from his bedroll to a crouch, the heavy pistol already in his hand. He put a finger to his lips, signaling for her to be absolutely quiet. Mary's heart pounded in her throat, the sound deafening in the stillness. "Who is it?" Eli called, his voice low and steady. A man's voice answered from the other side of the door, jovial and slick. "Just a lost traveler, friend, seeing your light, hoping for a bit of warmth before I freeze solid." Eli did not move. He stared at the door. His eyes narrowed in suspicion. "There are no other travelers in this storm." A hearty laugh came from outside. "Well now, that's where you're wrong. Me and my partners, we've been tracking some lost cargo. A pretty little thing in a white dress. You wouldn't have seen her, would you? We traced her to this very mountain." Mary's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. It was the man who had brokered her passage, the one with the ingratiating smile and the dead, empty eyes. Eli's voice dropped, losing all trace of civility. It was as cold and hard as river stone. "There is no one here. Move on." "I don't think so," the voice sneered. "I know she's in there. I can smell her. Now open this door, or we'll huff and we'll puff and we'll blow it down." Eli remained motionless for a beat, his gaze locked on the door. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached down and pried up a loose floorboard near the hearth. From the dark space beneath, he withdrew another pistol. This one was different. It was smaller, more elegant, its metal a gleaming, polished silver, with an ivory handle. He cocked it, the sound a sharp, deadly click in the quiet cabin. He rose to his full height and walked to the door, pressing his back against the log wall beside it. "Leave now," Eli said, his voice a low growl of pure menace. "This is your only warning." The man outside laughed again, a sound full of arrogant disbelief. "You and what army? Rancher?" The door shuddered as a heavy boot kicked it. Then another, harder kick. The wooden bar Eli had wedged in place groaned in protest. Eli did not raise his voice. He simply said, "The next time your foot touches this door, I will send a bullet through it." There was a sudden silence from outside. Then, a nervous chuckle. "No need for that, friend. Just a misunderstanding." Heavy footsteps crunched away in the snow. As they faded, the man's voice floated back on the wind, filled with a chilling promise. "We will be back for what's ours. You can count on it." Eli waited, pistol raised, until the sound of the footsteps was completely gone. Only then did he slowly lower the gun. He turned and looked at Mary, who was sitting bolt upright in the cot, clutching the blankets to her chin, her eyes wide with terror. The shared quiet of their sanctuary had been shattered. The world, with all its coldness and its cruelty, had found them. The silence that flooded the cabin after the man's footsteps faded was more terrifying than his threats. It was a cold, listening silence, filled with the phantom crunch of boots in the snow and the echo of his chilling promise. Mary sat frozen on the cot, the coarse wool of the blankets a poor defense against the terror that had seized her. Her teeth chattered, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that shook her whole body. This was not the slow, creeping cold of the blizzard. This was the icy grip of a fear she had known all her life, the fear of being hunted, of being treated as an object to be claimed. Eli stood by the door, the silver pistol still held loosely in his hand, his body a study in tense stillness. He was listening, not with his ears, but with his entire being, his senses reaching out into the storm-tossed darkness. When he was finally satisfied, they were alone. He slid the wooden bar back into place and turned. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, making it impossible to read his expression, but she could feel the cold fury radiating from him. He put the pistol back in its hiding place beneath the floorboards and walked to the hearth, his movements stiff and controlled. He stared into the dying embers, his back to her. The silence was unbearable. Mary knew she had to speak, to explain. He had saved her, and in doing so, had invited this danger into his sanctuary. He deserved to know the truth of what she was.
"He was one of them?"
she whispered, her voice cracking.
"The men who arranged everything?"
Eli said nothing. His silence was an accusation, a question she had to answer. Tears she had refused to shed on the train platform now streamed down her face, hot and shameful. It was not a marriage, not a real one. There were no papers, no preacher, my master. The man whose house I worked in, he owed them money. They took me as payment. Her confession came out in a torrent of ragged breaths, the words she had held locked inside her for months. He said they had a good man for me out west, a man with property. He said it was a chance for a new life, but it was a sale. I was bought, like a horse or a sack of flour. They shipped me here like cargo. She choked on a sob, burying her face in her hands.
"I am sorry. I did not mean to bring this trouble to you. I am nothing but stolen property."
She waited for his judgment, for the disgust in his voice. She expected him to tell her that she was on her own, that he would not risk his life for a woman who was not even legally her own person. Instead, when he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly rasp, vibrating with an emotion that was not disgust, but a deep and terrible anger. "I know." Mary looked up, startled, her tear-streaked face a mask of confusion.
You know?"
He turned from the fire, and in his eyes, she saw not the impassive stranger, but a man haunted by a private hell. "I know the man who spoke. His name is Silas Croft. He has a gold tooth on the left side of his mouth and a scar above his right eye. He works with a man named Beauregard, a big man with a wheezing laugh. They specialize in girls from the East, orphans, servants, girls no one will miss." Mary stared at him, her heart pounding. He had just described the two men who had put her on the train.
"How could you possibly know that?"
she breathed. A muscle tightened in Eli's jaw. He walked to the window and stared out into the blackness, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. "Because 4 years ago, they took my sister." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp as shards of glass. Mary felt as if the wind had been knocked out of her. Her name was Sarah, Eli said, his voice hollow.
She was 17, headstrong and full of life. After the fire, I was lost. I sent her to live with an aunt in Philadelphia, thinking she would be safe there, but she was lonely. She fell in with the wrong people. She wrote me a letter, full of stories about a charming man who had promised her a new life in California, a husband and a home of her own.
His voice broke, and he paused, wrestling for control. It was the last I ever heard from her. By the time I realized what had happened, she was gone. The man had vanished. He took a deep, shuddering breath. I have been hunting them ever since. I have tracked them across the territory, from one mining camp to the next. I have learned their methods, their faces. I heard whispers they were operating up here, in these mountains. That is why I am here. Mary, I was not just watching you on that platform. I was watching for them. The pieces of his past clicked into place, forming a picture of devastating clarity. The refined posture, the hidden weapons, the maps, the grim solitude. It was all part of his quest. He was not a ranch hand running from his grief. He was a hunter, driven by a desperate 4-year-old hope. And she had, by a terrible twist of fate, stumbled right into the middle of his hunt. The fear that had gripped her began to recede, replaced by a profound, aching empathy. His loss was a mirror of her own, a different kind of theft, but a theft of family all the same. They were two sides of the same tarnished coin. The dynamic in the cabin changed after that night. The danger was no longer a vague threat from the storm, but a palpable presence, waiting for them just beyond the door. Yet, instead of driving them apart, this shared peril bound them together. The last of the pretense fell away. They were no longer a stranger and his ward, but two people caught in the same snare. He began to talk to her, not in long conversations, but in small, shared moments. He told her about Sarah, about her laugh and her stubborn refusal to wear the dresses their mother picked for them. Mary, in turn, told him about her own mother, about the feel of her hands, rough with the needle pricks, and the lullabies she would hum late at night. They were building a bridge across the chasm of their loneliness, plank by painful plank. A few days later, as he prepared to go out and check his trap lines, he paused at the door. He was looking at her hands, which were red and chapped from her work around the cabin. Without a word, he went to his saddlebags and pulled out a pair of leather gloves. They were worn soft with use, lined with rabbit fur, and sized for his large hands, but they were a shield against the biting cold. He held them out to her. "Here," he said gruffly. "Your hands will freeze otherwise." Mary took them, her fingers brushing against his. The leather was still warm. It was the most practical of gifts, but it felt like a declaration. He was not just providing for her survival. He was actively protecting her, thinking of her comfort. She slid her hands into the gloves, the soft fur a small, profound luxury. "Thank you, Eli," she said, and for the first time since she had met him, she smiled when she said his name. It was a small, hesitant smile, but it was genuine. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a softening of his hard expression, before he turned and disappeared into the snow. Just when it seemed the first blizzard was finally losing its strength, another one rolled in from the north, even more ferocious than the last. It slammed into the cabin with the force of a physical blow, and the temperature dropped to a level that felt unsurvivable. The world shrank to the 4 log walls of their shelter. Mary began to feel a deep, unshakable chill that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. It was a cold that started in her bones and spread outward. Her head ached with a dull, persistent throb, and her limbs felt heavy as lead. By evening, she was shivering violently, even huddled next to the roaring fire. Eli watched her. His eyes narrowed with a new kind of concern. He came over and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. His touch was cool and dry against her burning skin. "You have a fever," he stated, his voice stripped of all emotion. replaced by a clinical precision that was both jarring and strangely reassuring. The night was a blur of misery for Mary. She was tossed on a turbulent sea of heat and cold, her thoughts fragmented and nonsensical. At one point, she was back on the train platform, the wind slicing through her dress. Then she was a small child again, locked in a dark pantry, her stomach cramping with hunger. Through it all, Eli was a constant, steady presence. The ranch hand vanished completely, replaced by the doctor he had once been. He moved with a quiet, confident authority, his hands gentle but firm. He bathed her face and wrists with snow he melted in a bowl. The shock of the cold, a brief, blessed relief from the fire raging within her. He disappeared into the storm for a short time and returned with a handful of pine needles and willow bark, which he crushed and steeped in hot water, holding the cup to her lips and making her drink the bitter, aromatic tea. He did not hover, but he never left her side, his watchfulness a silent, protective shield. In the deepest troughs of her delirium, the carefully constructed walls around her heart crumbled. The raw, desperate desires of her soul came spilling out in broken whispers. She murmured about the cold, about being alone, about the men whose faces she could never forget. And then, in a moment of startling clarity, her voice rose, barely audible above the shriek of the wind, but clear and filled with a lifetime of yearning. "Just once," she whispered to the flickering shadows on the ceiling. "I wanted to be loved, just once, without being used." Eli, sitting in a chair he had pulled close to the cot, went utterly still. Her words, raw and unadorned, struck him with the force of a physical blow. They pierced through the thick layers of his own grief and cynicism, finding the lonely, wounded core of the man he used to be. He looked down at the woman in the bed, her face flushed with fever, her brow furrowed in a tormented sleep. And he saw not just a victim he had rescued, but a kindred spirit, a soul as scarred and adrift as his own. When Mary finally surfaced from the fever, it was to the quiet hush of a world blanketed in new snow. The storm had broken. Pale morning light filtered through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. Her body felt weak and hollowed out, but her mind was clear. The fire in her veins had been extinguished. She turned her head on the straw mattress. Eli was slumped in the chair beside her bed, fast asleep. His head rested on his arms, which were crossed on the edge of the cot. One of his hands, calloused and scarred, was loosely clasping hers. It was clear he had not slept all night, that he had stayed by her side through the worst of the fever. He was holding her hand not like a doctor taking a pulse, but with a desperate, possessive grip, as if he were terrified that if he let go, she might drift away and disappear. A powerful, unfamiliar emotion welled up in her chest. It was a feeling so warm and overwhelming, it brought tears to her eyes. He was not just her protector. He was not just a hunter seeking vengeance. In that moment, seeing the exhaustion and vulnerability on his sleeping face, she knew, with absolute certainty, that he cared for her. Later that day, after she had managed to sip some broth and sit up, propped against the wall, the final confession came. He sat across from her at the small table, nursing a cup of coffee, the silence between them now comfortable and freighted with unspoken emotion. "You were a good doctor," she said softly. He looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "I was," he admitted, his voice quiet. "In New York, I had a practice on a street lined with brownstone houses. I was wealthy, respected." He stared into his cup, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "I married into one of the oldest families in the city, a beautiful woman with a laugh like wind chimes and eyes the color of a summer sky. We had a son. We had everything." He looked up at her then, and the grief in his eyes was so raw, so profound, that she felt her own heart ache in response. And then one night, a faulty flue, a stray ember, and it was all gone, turned to ash. I survived, but the man I was, the doctor, the husband, the father, he died in that fire. He drew a ragged breath. I could not stay there. Every street corner, every face, was a ghost. So I fled. I came west with no purpose, no plan. I just wanted to find a place so empty it would match the emptiness inside me. I thought I had found it here. He looked at her, and his gaze was intense, searching. Until I saw you on that platform. Mary's heart ached for him, for the scale of his loss, for the life that had been stolen from him. She saw past the stoic mask to the broken man beneath, and she did not see a man who was empty. She saw a man who had saved her, who had cared for her with a fierce and gentle tenderness. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and for the first time, she touched his face. Her fingers traced the faint, pale line of the scar on his cheek. He did not flinch. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch as if it were a balm he had been craving for years. "That man did not die in the fire," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He is still here. You are still whole." She met his gaze, her own eyes shining with unshed tears. "You saved me, Eli, from the cold, from those men. I cannot stop feeling that." The space between them seemed to shimmer, charged with all the unspoken words, all the shared pain and fragile hope. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not move. She leaned in to meet him. Their first kiss was not a thing of fire and passion. It was quiet and slow and profound. It was a kiss of gratitude, of recognition, of two broken souls finding solace in one another. His lips were soft, hesitant, as if he had forgotten how to do this. She tasted sorrow and whiskey and the faint, bitter tang of willow bark. It was the saddest, most beautiful kiss of her life. It was a promise, in the heart of a frozen wilderness, that they were no longer alone. The tender moment was shattered by a sound like a thunderclap. The cabin door exploded inward, torn from its leather hinges, slamming against the wall. The bright, cold light of dawn flooded the room, silhouetting three figures standing in the doorway. It was Silas Croft and the big man, Beauregard, and between them stood a third man, his face pinched and cruel, wearing a tarnished star on his chest. "Well, well," the sheriff sneered, his eyes taking in the scene. Mary in the bed, Eli leaning over her. "Looks like we found the stolen property, and the thief who took her." Before Eli could react, Beauregard lunged forward, grabbing Mary by the arm. His grip was like an iron vice. He hauled her out of the bed, the blankets tangling around her legs. The cold air hit her bare skin, and she cried out, a sound of shock and pain. "Let her go!" Eli roared, his voice a guttural snarl as he moved to protect her. Silas Croft raised a pistol, the hammer cocked, its dark eye aimed squarely at Eli's chest. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Doctor," he said, his voice a silky, vicious purr. "This is official business now. The girl is coming with us." He nodded at Beauregard, who began to drag Mary toward the door. She fought, kicking and scratching, her bare feet scrabbling for purchase on the rough floorboards. She screamed Eli's name, her voice a raw, desperate plea, as she was pulled from the warmth and safety of the cabin out into the brutal, unforgiving snow. The world outside the broken doorway was a maelstrom of white. Snow, driven by a relentless wind, swirled into the cabin, instantly melting on the warm floorboards and turning the air frigid. Mary's scream was swallowed by the storm as Beauregard, his face a mask of brutish determination, dragged her toward a pair of horses that stood waiting, their heads bowed against the gale. Inside, Eli stood frozen for a single, heart-stopping moment. Silas Croft's pistol was steady, his eyes glittering with triumphant malice. The sheriff, whose name Eli neither knew nor cared to know, was already moving to block any path of escape, his hand resting on the butt of his own gun. "This is a mistake, Sheriff," Eli said, his voice dangerously calm. He pitched his words to the man with the star, appealing to the veneer of law, however thin it might be. "This woman was sold into a fraudulent arrangement. There is no legal contract. These men are traffickers, wanted in 3 territories." The sheriff laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound. "All I see is a runaway bride and a claim filed by Mr. Hobbs. He paid a hefty price for her, and he paid me a hefty fee to retrieve his property." His greedy eyes flicked over Mary's form, then back to Eli. "What happens to her at the mining camp ain't my concern. Now stand down. It is over." It was the finality in the sheriff's voice, the casual dismissal of Mary's life as a mere transaction, that broke the iron control Eli had maintained for 4 long years. The careful discipline, the calculated hunt, the doctor's detached analysis, it all shattered. In its place rose a raw, primal fury, the same helpless rage he had felt standing before the burning ruins of his home. He had lost everything to the cruel indifference of fate once. He would not lose her to the calculated cruelty of men. He did not lunge for the gun. They expected that. Instead, his eyes darted to the hearth. The iron poker, long and heavy, still glowed with a faint red heat at its tip. He moved. It was not the clumsy charge of a desperate ranch hand. It was the explosive, coiled speed of a predator. He took 1 step, not toward Silas, but toward the fireplace, in a single, fluid motion. He snatched the poker from its hook. The movement was so unexpected that for a fraction of a second, the 3 men simply stared. That fraction was all he needed. He pivoted, the heavy iron scything through the air. The sheriff, caught flat-footed, had only time to raise an arm in a futile attempt to block the blow. The poker connected with his forearm with a sickening crunch of bone, and then slammed into the side of his head. The sheriff's eyes rolled back, and he crumpled to the floor like a sack of grain, unconscious before he even landed. Silas Croft swore, his pistol swiveling to track Eli's motion. He fired. The roar of the gunshot in the small cabin was deafening. The bullet, aimed for Eli's heart, went wide, slamming into the cast-iron stove with a high-pitched metallic shriek. The stovepipe, weakened by rust, tore from its sealing joint and crashed to the floor, belching a cloud of thick, black smoke into the room. Chaos erupted. The cabin was instantly filled with a blinding, choking fog of soot and smoke. Snow poured in through the shattered window, adding to the disorienting swirl. Beauregard, startled by the gunshot, loosened his grip on Mary for a second. It was the opening she needed. With a desperate cry, she bit down hard on the fleshy part of his hand. He roared in pain and fury, instinctively releasing her. Mary scrambled away, her bare feet slipping on the wet floor. "Eli!" she screamed, her voice a raw beacon in the chaos. Eli was already moving, using the smoke as cover. He lunged toward Silas, the poker held like a short spear, but Silas was a seasoned scoundrel. He dropped to one knee, firing again through the smoke. This time, the bullet found its mark. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in Eli's left side, just above his hip. It felt as if he had been kicked by a mule. The force of it staggered him, and he stumbled, the poker clattering to the floor. Through the thinning smoke, he saw Silas grinning, a flash of yellowed teeth in the gloom. "Gotcha, doctor!" But the fight had been knocked out of them. Their advantage of surprise was gone. The sheriff was down, and the cabin was a wreck. Their only goal now was to retrieve their prize and flee. Get the girl!" Silas yelled. Beauregard, cursing and shaking his wounded hand, lunged for Mary again. He caught the back of the flannel shirt she wore, the fabric tearing in his grip. He wrapped a massive arm around her waist, lifting her off her feet. She kicked and fought, her fists beating uselessly against his thick back, but he was immensely strong. He half carried, half dragged her out of the ruined cabin and into the blinding blizzard. Eli pushed himself to his feet, his side screaming in agony. He pressed a hand to the wound, and it came away slick and warm with blood. He could see them through the broken doorway. Two dark shapes in the swirling snow, hoisting Mary onto the back of a horse. Silas was already mounted, holding the reins of the second animal. Eli staggered to the wall where he kept his rifle, a heavy Winchester, slung on a pair of pegs. He grabbed it, his movements clumsy with pain. He had to follow. The thought of Mary in the hands of those men, being taken to a mining camp to be handed over to a brute like Hobbs, was a torment worse than any bullet wound. He burst out of the cabin, ignoring the biting wind that tore at his thin shirt. Silas saw him and raised his pistol, but firing accurately in the gale was nearly impossible. He settled for a final, taunting shout. "She is ours! You lost!" Then he spurred his horse, and he and Beauregard disappeared into the white curtain of the storm, taking Mary with them. Eli did not hesitate. His own horse, the black stallion, was in the lean-to beside the cabin. He fumbled with the saddle, his fingers numb and slick with blood. Every movement sent a fresh wave of agony through his side, but he grit his teeth against it. He swung himself into the saddle, a groan of pain escaping his lips. He leaned low over the horse's neck, the Winchester held tight in his right hand, and urged the powerful animal forward, following the fresh tracks in the snow. The world was a featureless expanse of white. The wind howled in his ears, and the snow stung his face like 1,000 tiny needles. The tracks were already beginning to fade, but he pushed the horse onward, his eyes straining to see through the blizzard. His only guide was the dark, churning shape of the forest ahead, the direction his quarry had fled. Blood was seeping through his shirt, a warm, wet patch that was quickly growing cold. He knew the wound was bad, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the cold terror that clutched at his heart. He had found something in that cabin, something he thought he had lost forever, a reason to live. And now it was being ripped away from him. A few miles ahead, Mary was fighting with the ferocity of a cornered animal. She was seated in front of Beauregard, his huge arm clamped around her middle like a steel band. She writhed and twisted, trying to dig her elbows into his ribs, trying to stamp on his feet. "Hold still, you little cat," he snarled, his breath hot and foul on her neck. He tightened his grip, squeezing the air from her lungs. "Tie her hands," Silas shouted over the wind. "She is more trouble than she is worth." Beauregard fumbled with a length of rope from his saddlebag. As he tried to loop it around her wrists, Mary saw her chance. She threw her head back with all her might, connecting with the underside of his jaw. His teeth clicked together with a sharp crack, and he yelped, his head snapping back. In that instant, his grip loosened. Mary shoved herself away from him, trying to slide off the side of the horse. She almost made it. Her feet touched the snow, but Beauregard recovered, grabbing a fistful of her hair and yanking her back with brutal force. She cried out as pain shot through her scalp. "That is it," he roared, his face contorted with rage. He backhanded her across the face. The blow was stunning, sending a shower of stars across her vision. He pushed her forward against the saddle horn and quickly, expertly, bound her wrists together in front of her. "Another move like that, and I will gag you, too." Mary slumped against him, defeated for the moment, the taste of blood in her mouth. But as the world swam back into focus, she saw something through the swirling snow. They were entering a narrow pass between two sheer rock faces, a natural bottleneck in the trail. And at the far end of the pass, a dark shape was waiting. It was Eli. He was sitting on his stallion, blocking the path, the long barrel of his Winchester resting on his thigh. His face was a pale, grim mask, his hat gone, his dark hair plastered to his head by the snow. Silas and Beauregard reined in their horses. "Well, look at that," Silas said with a sneer. "The good doctor came to make a house call." "Let her go, Croft!" Eli's voice cut through the wind, low and steady. "Right away, and I will let you live." Silas laughed, a sound devoid of all humor.
You are in no position to be making threats. You are one man, and you are bleeding." He raised his pistol. "This is where it ends." He fired, not at Eli, but at his horse. The stallion screamed, a high, piercing sound of agony, as the bullet tore into its chest. The magnificent animal reared up, its legs buckling, and then crashed to the ground in a heap, throwing Eli clear. Eli landed hard in the deep snow, the impact jarring his entire body and sending a blinding flash of pain through his wounded side. He had lost his horse, his only advantage of speed and height. He was on foot, wounded, in a blizzard, against 2 armed men on horseback. He pushed himself to one knee, raising the Winchester. He was a doctor. He knew the human body, its strengths and its vulnerabilities. And for 4 years, he had been a hunter. He fired, not a panicked shot, but a carefully aimed one. The bullet struck Silas's horse in the foreleg. The animal shrieked and went down, pitching Silas headfirst into a snowdrift. Beauregard, seeing his partner fall, spurred his own horse forward, charging directly at Eli, his pistol drawn. He intended to ride him down. Eli worked the lever action of the rifle, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a new one. He did not have time to aim properly. He fired from the hip. The bullet hit Beauregard in the thigh, ripping through the thick muscle. Beauregard screamed, a sound of rage and agony, and nearly dropped his gun. The charge faltered as his horse shied away from the fallen stallion. Silas was back on his feet now, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He raised his pistol and fired at the same instant Eli turned the Winchester toward him. A double explosion rocked the narrow pass. Silas's shot struck Eli high in the right shoulder. The impact was like being hit with a sledgehammer. It spun him around, knocking the rifle from his nerveless grasp. His arm went numb, and a fresh, searing pain burned through him. Eli's bullet caught Silas in the arm, shattering the bone. The pistol flew from his hand, and he staggered back, clutching his ruined limb, his face ashen with shock and pain. For a moment, all 3 men were out of the fight. Eli was on the ground, bleeding from 2 wounds. Silas was disarmed, his shooting arm useless. Beauregard was trying to control his horse, his leg a bloody mess. It was in that moment of stalemate that Mary acted, with a surge of adrenaline. She threw herself sideways, using all her weight. Beauregard, distracted by the pain in his leg and the chaos of the fight, was caught off balance. Mary tumbled from the horse, landing in the soft, deep snow. Her hands were still bound, but she was free. She scrambled to her feet and ran, not away from the fight, but toward it. She ran to Eli, who was trying to push himself up, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked up and saw her, and for a second, his expression was one of pure, agonizing despair. "Mary, run!" he gasped. But she did not run. She threw herself onto him, trying to cover his body with her own, as if her small frame could somehow shield him from any more bullets. She looked at his pale face, at the blood staining his shirt and the snow around them, and a terrible, desperate sob broke from her lips. "You will freeze out here," she cried, her tears hot against his cold cheek. She pressed her face to his, her bound hands resting on his chest. "You will die for me." Eli's one good arm came up, wrapping around her, pulling her tight against him. He was shaking, not from the cold, but from pain and blood loss. He looked into her eyes, and in their dark depths, she saw not fear, but a strange, sad peace. He whispered, his voice a ragged breath against her hair. "I already did once." Together, they huddled in the snow as Silas and Beauregard, one wounded in the arm, the other in the leg, cursed them both and slowly, painfully, managed to get Silas onto the remaining horse and retreat back down the pass, beaten and defeated. They were alone. The wind howled around them, a mournful, triumphant sound. The silence of the wilderness descended once more. Eli was growing weaker, his body going limp in her arms.
Mary knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that if they stayed there, they would die. The cold would finish what the bullets had started. "We have to move," she said, her voice frantic. She looked around, her eyes scanning the rock face. She saw a dark slash in the stone, a narrow crevice, barely visible through the swirling snow. It was not much, but it was shelter. "Can you walk?" she begged, shaking him gently. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "I can try." With her help, he staggered to his feet. He leaned heavily on her, his arm draped over her shoulders. Every step was an agony for him. They moved slowly, a single wounded creature struggling against the storm. They reached the crevice and practically fell inside. It was shallow, but it offered a respite from the relentless wind. Eli slumped against the rock wall, his head lolling to one side. His breathing was shallow, his lips tinged with blue. "Fire," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Matches, in my coat." Mary fumbled in the pockets of his coat with her still-bound hands, her fingers clumsy and numb. She found the small, oilskin-wrapped packet. Her heart sank when she opened it. There were only 2 matches left, 2 chances. She gathered a few dry twigs from the back of the crevice and a piece of birch bark from a fallen log. She positioned the kindling carefully, shielding it with her body. She took the first match. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She struck it against the rock. It flared for a second, a tiny, brilliant spark of hope. And then the wind gusted, and it was gone. A sob of despair caught in her throat. 1 chance left. She took a deep breath, trying to still her trembling hands. She whispered a prayer to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. She took the final match, held it firmly, and struck it hard against the stone. It flared to life, with infinite care. She brought the flame to the edge of the birch bark. The bark curled, blackened, and then caught. A small, steady orange flame dancing to life. She fed the tiny fire with twigs, then larger sticks, her bound hands making the work slow and awkward. Slowly, painstakingly, the fire grew, pushing back the oppressive cold, casting a warm, flickering light on the stone walls of their small sanctuary. She turned back to Eli. He was watching her, his eyes clouded with pain, but filled with a profound, unspoken emotion. The firelight danced on the silver pistol he had used, which had fallen from his belt and lay half buried in the snow beside him. Night fell. Mary sat with Eli's head in her lap, his body racked with shivers. She held him, rocking him gently as if he were a child, murmuring soft, soothing words into the darkness. She was no longer a victim, no longer cargo. She was a guardian, a protector, and she would not let the wilderness, or the wounds, or the coming night take him from her. She would hold on to him until the end. The first 24 hours in the crevice were a desperate, shivering prayer. Mary kept the fire alive with a miser's frugality, feeding it stick by precious stick, her bound hands making every movement a clumsy, agonizing chore. Eli drifted in a shallow, restless state between consciousness and delirium, his body radiating a feverish heat that was at odds with the deathly chill of his skin. The blood had clotted on his wounds, but the crude bandages she had fashioned from strips of her flannel shirt were soaked through. She knew, with the cold certainty of a death sentence, that the bullets were still inside him, and that fever and infection were now enemies as dangerous as the storm. On the second morning, the wind died, and a fragile, gray light filled the sky. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, a landscape of profound and treacherous beauty. The immediate danger of freezing had passed, but the slow, patient threat of starvation and infection had just begun. Eli was weaker, his breathing more ragged. They could not stay in the exposed crevice. Summoning a strength she did not know she possessed, Mary managed to get him to his feet. He was a dead weight against her, his mind lost in a fog of pain. She found his silver pistol. its ivory handle cold as bone, and tucked it into the waistband of her trousers. Then, step by agonizing step, she half dragged, half carried him through the deep, untrodden snow. She had no destination, only a desperate forward momentum, a refusal to lie down and die. After what felt like an eternity, she saw it through the trees, a small, dark shape almost completely buried in a snowdrift. It was a cabin, smaller and cruder than Eli's, with a sagging roof and a chimney that listed to one side. An abandoned trapper's shack. It was a miracle. Getting inside was another ordeal. The door was frozen shut, but a section of the wall, where the chinking had rotted away, was weak, with a piece of firewood as a lever. Mary managed to pry loose a few of the logs, creating an opening just large enough to squeeze through. The inside was dark and smelled of cold ash, dust, and the faint, musky scent of old animal pelts. It was empty, save for a crumbling stone hearth, a broken chair, and a pile of rotting furs in one corner. But it had 4 walls and a roof. It was a fortress. She dragged Eli inside and made him as comfortable as she could on the pile of furs, covering him with his own heavy coat. Her first, most urgent task was to free her hands. Using a sharp piece of stone she found in the hearth, she sawed and scraped at the thick rope binding her wrists. It was slow, frustrating work, her fingers numb and clumsy. But finally, the last strand gave way. She rubbed her raw, chafed wrists, a sob of relief catching in her throat. She was free. The days that followed blurred into a single, grueling test of endurance. Mary's entire existence shrank to the confines of the shack and the simple, brutal necessities of survival. Her life became a cycle of 3 tasks: tending the fire, tending to Eli, and finding more wood. She learned to read the forest, to spot the dry, dead branches on the underside of the pines, the ones that would burn hot and clean. She found the trapper's old axe, its head rusted but its edge still serviceable. At first, she could barely lift it, and her swings were clumsy and weak. But hunger and cold were powerful teachers. With trembling hands and an aching back, she learned to chop wood. The rhythmic thud of the axe against the frozen logs the only sound for miles around. Her soft hands, accustomed to darning and scrubbing, became a raw landscape of blisters, cuts, and splinters. Eli remained lost to her, a ship adrift on a fever sea. He was a body to be tended, a life to be guarded. She cleaned his wounds as best she could with melted snow and the last of the French whiskey from his flask, a terrible waste that made her weep even as she did it. The bullet in his side had gone clean through, leaving a ragged exit wound, but the one in his shoulder was lodged deep. The flesh around it was hot, swollen, and an angry red. The infection was taking hold. He murmured constantly, his voice a low, broken rasp. He spoke to people who were not there. He called out for Sarah, his words a jumble of childhood memories and desperate, 4-year-old pleas. "Just one more letter," he would whisper, his brow furrowed in anguish. "Tell me where you are. Sarah, I will come for you." Then the fire would come. He would thrash against the furs, his eyes wide with a terror that saw past the log walls of the shack and into the heart of his own personal hell. "The smoke," he would gasp, his hands clutching at his throat. "I cannot reach him. The stairs are gone. My boy." In these moments, Mary would hold him, her small frame struggling to contain his strength. She would speak to him, her voice low and steady, a constant, soothing murmur. She did not know if he could hear her, but she spoke anyway. She told him he was safe. She told him the fire was out. She told him Mary was here, and sometimes, in the depths of his delirium, his thrashing would cease. He would turn his head toward the sound of her voice. His breathing would steady, and he would whisper her name, a single, questioning word in the darkness. Mary? Her voice, it seemed, was the only anchor that could pull him back from the inferno of his memories. Their meager supplies ran out. The last of the dried meat from Eli's saddlebags was gone. A gnawing hunger set in, a constant, dull ache in the pit of her stomach. She knew she could not survive on melted snow and pine needle tea forever. More importantly, Eli needed broth, real food, to fight the fever that was consuming him. She had to leave the shack. She had to hunt. The thought terrified her. She had been safe within these four walls, her world small and controllable. To step out into the vast, silent wilderness, armed with nothing but a pistol she barely knew how to use, felt like stepping off the edge of the world. But looking at Eli's pale, sweat-sheened face, she knew she had no choice. She took the silver revolver. It felt unnaturally heavy and cold in her hand. She checked it as she had seen him do, making sure it was loaded. She took a deep breath, slid back the broken logs, and stepped outside. The forest was unnervingly quiet. The snow muffled all sound, and the tall pines seemed to stand as silent, watching sentinels. She moved slowly, her senses on high alert, every snap of a twig under her boot making her jump. She was looking for rabbit tracks, anything to show that life existed in this frozen world. She found nothing. The forest was as empty and barren as a tomb. She had wandered farther from the shack than she intended when she felt it, a prickling on the back of her neck, the primal, instinctual feeling of being watched. She stopped, her heart hammering against her ribs. She scanned the trees, her eyes wide, and then she saw it. Perched on a high, snow-covered branch, almost invisible against the gray bark of an aspen, was a cougar. It was long and lean, its tawny coat blending perfectly with the winter landscape. It was also desperately thin, its ribs showing faintly beneath its fur. It was starving. Its yellow eyes were fixed on her with a cold, intelligent hunger. Mary froze, her blood turning to ice. The animal was between her and the shack. It gathered its powerful hind legs beneath it, its tail twitching almost imperceptibly. It was preparing to spring. There was no time to think, no time for fear. All the terror, all the desperation of the past weeks coalesced into a single, sharp point of action. She raised the revolver with both hands, just as she had seen men do in the towns she had passed through. The barrel shook. She tried to steady it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The cougar let out a low, guttural snarl, a sound that vibrated deep in her chest. It leaped. It was a beautiful, terrible arc of muscle and claw, a silent, deadly projectile aimed directly at her. In that split second, as the world seemed to slow down, Mary pulled the trigger. The explosion was shocking. A deafening roar that ripped through the forest's silence. The recoil slammed her shoulder, nearly knocking her off her feet. For a moment, she was blind, her vision filled with the flash of gunpowder. When she could see again, the cougar lay in the snow not 10 feet from her, a dark, still heap. It had been killed in midair, its trajectory altered by the impact of the bullet. It had fallen short. Mary stood shaking, the heavy pistol dangling from her hand. She stared at the dead animal, at the dark stain of blood spreading across the pristine white snow. She had killed it. She, who had never harmed a living thing in her life, had taken a life to save her own. A wave of nausea and revulsion washed over her. She stumbled to a tree and was violently sick. Then, she sank to her knees in the snow and wept. She wept for the beautiful, starving animal. She wept for the girl she had been, the one who would have been too terrified to even raise a gun. And she wept with the terrible, frightening knowledge that that girl was gone forever, replaced by this new, harder version of herself, a woman who could kill to survive. After a long time, her tears subsided, replaced by a grim resolve. She could not let the animal go to waste. It was meat, it was life. With the trapper's axe and a small skinning knife she found in Eli's pack, she did what she had to do, her stomach churning, her mind shutting down against the gruesomeness of the task. She returned to the shack hours later, exhausted, blood-spattered, and carrying a heavy portion of meat wrapped in the animal's pelt. She had left the shack a frightened girl. She returned a provider. The rich, savory broth she made from the cougar meat seemed to work a slow magic. For the first time in days, the fierce heat of Eli's fever began to recede. The angry redness of his wounds lessened. He slept more peacefully, his delirious murmurs fading into a deep, healing silence. Mary watched him, her hope a fragile, flickering flame she barely dared to nurture. One afternoon, she sat on the floor by the hearth, stitching a patch onto the knee of her borrowed trousers, her head nodding with exhaustion. She had not had a full night's sleep in what felt like weeks. Her body ached, her fingers were a mass of blisters, and her cheeks were hollowed out by hunger and fatigue. Finally, she could fight it no longer. The needle slipped from her grasp, and she slumped against the hearth, falling into a deep, dreamless sleep. She awoke to a gentle touch on her forehead. She blinked, her vision blurry. Eli was leaning over her. He was awake, and he was lucid. His eyes, though still shadowed with pain and weariness, were clear. He had propped himself up on one elbow and was looking down at her, his expression a mixture of awe, concern, and a tenderness that made her heart ache. He reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. His fingers were cool against her skin. He saw the raw blisters on her hands, the dark circles under her eyes, the new, fierce strength in the set of her jaw. He saw everything she had done, everything she had become, to keep him alive. His lips moved, but at first no sound came out. He swallowed and tried again, his voice a hoarse, rusty whisper. Mary. Just her name, but he said it as if it were a prayer, a question, an answer, all at once. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of relief so profound they felt like pain. She did not speak. She could not. She simply looked at him, and in that shared gaze, everything was understood. The terror, the fight, the desperation, the quiet, stubborn refusal to let go. He laid back down, exhausted by the effort, but he kept his eyes on her. Slowly, she moved to his side, lying down on the furs next to him, and then he reached for her. They embraced again, but this time was different from the frantic, desperate clutch in the snow. This was a quiet, slow, and solemn coming together. Their bodies, both weakened and scarred, trembled as they held each other. It was not the shaking of lust or passion, but of a deeper, more elemental force. It was the tremor of shared grief, of profound and desperate need, of the sheer, overwhelming will to survive that had bound their souls together. They were not a man and a woman in that moment. They were two survivors, clinging to the edge of the world and in each other's arms. They had found solid ground. Spring came early that year. The thaw arrived not as a gentle melt, but as a sudden, dramatic breaking. The iron grip of winter loosened its hold. The snow receded, the streams began to run, and the first hints of green appeared on the forest floor. With the coming of the spring, Eli's strength returned. The wounds healed, leaving behind new, angry scars to map the history of his survival. The day finally came when he was strong enough to travel. They packed what little they had, the axe, the silver pistol, the cougar pelt, and left the trapper's shack behind. As they walked back toward their own cabin, the world felt new, reborn. The air was soft and smelled of damp earth and pine. They found their cabin partially looted. The door was still broken, and the window was shattered. The medical supplies were gone, as were the French whiskey and most of the tins of food. Silas and his men, it seemed, had come back to salvage what they could, but the cabin was still standing. It was their home. They began to rebuild, working together in a comfortable, practiced silence. Eli, with his renewed strength, repaired the door and fashioned a crude but effective shutter for the window. Mary, meanwhile, explored the surrounding woods, discovering the wild roots and edible greens that were pushing up through the newly thawed earth. She cleared a small patch of ground near the cabin and planted them, An act of faith, a commitment to a future she was only just beginning to believe in. One evening, as the last of the sun's rays painted the snow-capped peaks in hues of rose and gold, they sat together outside the cabin, watching the day end. The air was cool but no longer biting. A profound sense of peace had settled between them. Eli rose and went inside. When he returned, he knelt before her in the soft, damp earth. He held out his hand. Lying on his palm was a simple, elegant gold ring. It was worn with age, its surface smooth and glowing in the twilight. "It was my wife's," he said, his voice quiet and steady. "It was the only thing I took from the house before I left. It is all I have left of that life." Mary stared at the ring, her heart constricting. It was beautiful, but it was a ghost. It belonged to another woman, another life, a perfect love that had been turned to ash. "I cannot take this, Eli," she whispered, shaking her head. "It is hers." She tried to close his fingers over the ring, to give it back to him, but he would not let her. He caught her hand, his grip gentle but firm, and looked directly into her eyes. His own were shining with an emotion so powerful, so sincere, that it took her breath away. "That life is gone," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "I thought I was gone with it. You saved me. Mary." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her blistered knuckles. "That fire did not take me. Grief did, grief and guilt and a darkness so deep I thought I would never see the light again." He looked at her, his soul bared in his gaze. "Until you—" He slipped the golden ring onto her finger. It was loose, a circle of sunlight on her worn, chapped hand, but it felt as if it had been forged for her. It was not a claim, but a promise that the past, with all its ghosts and all its sorrow, could be a foundation for something new. Mary looked from the ring to his face, and in the depths of his dark eyes, she saw her own reflection, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly seen. She was not a servant, not cargo, not a victim. She was Mary, and she was home. The journey down the mountain was a descent into another world. The high, silent wilderness of snow and pine slowly gave way to the muddy, rutted tracks of civilization. The air, which had been clean and sharp, grew thick with the smells of wood smoke, livestock, and humanity. For weeks, their world had been only each other. Now, they were returning to the land of men, with its laws, its judgments, and its dangers. They made a strange pair, walking into the bustling mining town that sprawled in the valley below. Eli, though his clothes were worn from their ordeal, still carried the unmistakable air of a gentleman. His coat, though patched at the elbow by Mary's careful stitches, was of a fine, dark wool that spoke of Eastern tailors. He walked with a straight-backed confidence, his gaze steady and direct, even as a slight limp from his healing wound remained. And then there was Mary. She wore the same man's flannel shirt, now washed clean in a mountain stream but faded and frayed. Her trousers were patched, and the boots Eli had mended for her were caked in mud. Her face was thinner than it had been, her cheekbones more prominent, but the look in her eyes was no longer one of a frightened, abandoned girl. It was the clear, steady gaze of a woman who had faced death and chosen to live. The gold ring on her finger was a startling, incongruous flash of light against her rough attire. People stared. They stopped in the street, their conversations faltering. As this mismatched couple passed, the women looked at Mary with a mixture of pity and contempt, seeing a fallen creature in the company of a wealthy man. The men looked at Eli with suspicion and a grudging envy. Mary felt the heat of their gazes like a physical touch. A month ago, it would have made her shrink, her eyes cast down to the dirt. Now, she lifted her chin a little higher and met their stares, her hand resting lightly on Eli's arm. He felt her touch, and his own hand came to rest over hers. A silent, protective gesture that was all the answer they needed to give. They took a room at the town's only boarding house, a clean but Spartan establishment run by a stern-faced widow who looked them over with deep disapproval but accepted Eli's silver coins readily enough. They had been in the room less than an hour when the knock came at the door. It was the sheriff. His arm was in a sling, and a fresh, livid bruise colored the side of his face where the poker had struck him. He was not alone. 2 burly deputies stood behind him, their hands resting on their pistols, his eyes, cold and hard as pebbles, fixed on Eli. "Elias Thorne," he said, the name a venomous hiss. "I reckon you thought you got away. You are under arrest for assault of a lawman and for the abduction of this woman." He jerked his chin toward Mary. "I abducted no one, Sheriff," Eli said, his voice calm and even. "And I acted in self-defense, and in defense of her." "That ain't how Silas Croft and Beauregard tell it," the sheriff sneered. "And it ain't how the circuit judge is gonna see it. He arrives on the afternoon train. You will have your trial, a quick one." The trial, as the sheriff had promised, was a swift and brutal affair. It was held not in a proper courthouse, but in the town's largest saloon. The chairs and tables pushed back to clear a space. The air was thick with the stench of stale beer and unwashed bodies. The circuit judge was a pompous, portly man with a face flushed from drink and a clear desire to conclude the proceedings and return to the comfort of his private rail car. The sheriff, Silas, and Beauregard had crafted their story well. Silas, his arm also in a sling, his face a mask of false sincerity, spoke first. He painted a picture of Mary as a simple, confused girl, prone to fits of hysteria. He claimed she had been frightened by the wildness of the West and had run away in a panic. "All we wanted was to bring her back safely to her intended," Silas said, his voice dripping with feigned concern. "But this man, this Mr. Thorne, he had gotten into her head. He filled her with lies, promised her riches. He preyed on her weakness. When we tried to rescue her, he attacked us like a madman." Beauregard, limping heavily, corroborated the story with a series of grunts and nods, glaring at Mary as if she were a disobedient dog. The sheriff gave his own testimony, describing Eli's unprovoked and vicious assault. The story was a lie, a complete and utter fabrication, but it was simple, and it played to the prejudices of the crowd. They saw a wealthy Easterner, an outsider, meddling where he did not belong, and a foolish girl who had been led astray. Eli had money, Mary knew, a fortune, from the life he had left behind. He could have used it. He could have bribed the judge. The sheriff bought his way out of this farce, but when he stood to speak, he did not offer money. He offered only the truth. He spoke with the cool, detached precision of a doctor laying out a diagnosis. He recounted the events exactly as they had happened, from the moment he first saw Mary on the train platform to the gunfight in the pass. He detailed the workings of Croft's trafficking operation, citing names and locations he had uncovered in his 4-year search for his sister. His testimony was logical, detailed, and damning, but it was the word of one man, a stranger, against 3 others who, if not respected, were at least familiar fixtures in the territory. The judge listened with an expression of bored impatience, tapping his fingers on the table. "And what of the girl?" the judge asked, looking at Mary as if she were a piece of evidence. "Does she have anything to say for herself? Or is she as feeble-minded as Mr. Croft suggests?" A hush fell over the saloon. All eyes turned to Mary. She sat on a hard wooden bench beside Eli, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the gold ring a heavy weight on her finger. This was it. Her entire life had been a lesson in silence, in enduring, in making herself small and invisible. To speak now, in front of all these hostile, judging faces, felt like an impossible task. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and her throat went dry. She felt Eli's hand cover hers. He did not squeeze it. He just rested it there, a quiet, steady warmth that flowed into her, giving her strength. She looked at him, And in his eyes, she saw not pity, but a profound and unwavering belief in her. He had saved her life, but he could not do this for her. She had to claim her own voice. Slowly, she stood up. Her legs were trembling, but she locked her knees to keep them from buckling. She looked at the judge, at the jury of hostile faces in the crowd, at the smug, confident expressions of Silas and Beauregard. She began to speak, her voice at first a reedy whisper, barely audible over the shuffling of boots on the floorboards. "My name is Mary." She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was stronger, clearer, filled with a conviction that came from a place of deep and terrible certainty. "I am not feeble-minded, and I was not abducted by Mr. Thorne. I was sold." She told them everything. She spoke of her life as a servant's child, of being passed from house to house, of the cold and the hunger. She told them of the deal her master had made, of being handed over to Silas and Beauregard like a piece of property. She described the long, lonely train ride, the thin wedding dress, the abandonment at the station in the freezing cold. "I was waiting to be collected by a man I had never met," she said, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised even her. "But he never came. I was left to die, and I would have died, if not for Eli. He found me. He took me to his cabin and gave me food and warmth and shelter. He saved my life." The saloon had gone completely, unnervingly silent. The only sound was the crackle of the fire in the hearth. The smirks had vanished from the faces in the crowd, replaced by expressions of stunned disbelief. Mary turned her gaze on Silas Croft, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never imagined she possessed. "This man did not come to rescue me. He came to claim his cargo, because that is all I have ever been to him. Not a person, not a bride, just cargo, to be sold to the highest bidder at a mining camp." She recounted the fight at the cabin, the desperate flight through the blizzard, the gunfight in the pass. She spoke of the wounds, of the abandoned shack, of hunting a cougar to keep them from starving. By the time she finished, her voice was raw, but her gaze was unwavering. She had laid her entire life bare, with all its shame and all its pain, and in doing so, she had found a power she never knew she had. "Eli Thorne did not steal me," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but carrying to every corner of the room. "He is the only man in my entire life who has ever treated me like a human being." She sat down, her body trembling with the aftermath of her own courage. The silence in the room was absolute. And then, a sound broke the stillness. It was the sound of a woman weeping. In the back of the room, a middle-aged woman in a plain, faded dress stood up. Her face was lined with grief, her eyes red-rimmed. She was a homesteader's wife, her hands rough and calloused from work. "She is telling the truth," the woman said, her voice choked with tears. "My daughter, Clara, she was taken 2 years ago. A man came through, handsome and charming, promised her the world. We never saw her again." She pointed a trembling finger at Silas Croft. "It was him. I never forgot his face. He is the one who took my Clara." It was as if a dam had broken. Another woman stood up. Then another. A blacksmith spoke of a niece who had vanished from a town 2 territories over. A shopkeeper told a story of a young immigrant girl, an orphan like Mary, who had been promised a good marriage and had disappeared without a trace. The room filled with a rising murmur of shared grief and anger, a chorus of voices joining Mary's, all telling the same ugly story. The judge, his face now pale and sober, looked from the weeping women to the suddenly terrified faces of Silas and Beauregard. The tide had turned. This was no longer about one runaway girl. It was about a sickness that had been preying on their communities for years. He banged his gavel on the table, the sound a sharp crack of finality. "The marriage contract, being founded on coercion and deceit, is hereby declared null and void," he boomed, his voice full of a self-righteous fury he had not possessed moments before. "Mary is a free woman, under the protection of this court." He turned a venomous glare on the traffickers. As for these two, arrest them, and the sheriff as well, for his part in this despicable business. As deputies, their faces grim, hauled Silas and Beauregard away. The saloon erupted in a chaotic mixture of shouts and tears. Justice, swift and unexpected, had been served. Later, as the sun began to set, Mary and Eli stood on the platform of the train station, the very place where her nightmare had begun. The evening train was due, its whistle a faint cry in the distance. Eli held a ticket in his hand. "This will take you back east," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "To Philadelphia or Boston, anywhere you want to go. You could find work, start a new life, a real one. You are free. Mary, you can leave all of this behind." He offered her the ticket. It was his final gift to her, the ultimate act of love, the freedom to leave him. Mary looked at the ticket, then up at his face. She saw the fear in his eyes, the terrible vulnerability of a man who was offering up his own heart, fully expecting it to be broken again. She reached out and gently pushed his hand, and the ticket, away. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile of such warmth and certainty that it seemed to light up the twilight. "I do not need a new life, Eli," she said softly. "I already have one." They rebuilt the cabin together. They repaired the door, replaced the shattered window, and patched the hole in the stovepipe. They worked side by side, their movements falling into an easy, familiar rhythm. The cabin was no longer just his refuge from the world, or her temporary shelter. It was their home, built not just of logs and mud, but of shared survival and a love that had been forged in the coldest of fires. At night, they would lie outside on a blanket, wrapped in each other's arms, and watch the stars. A brilliant, silent river of diamonds spilled across the black velvet sky. They rarely spoke of the past, but it was always there, a quiet presence between them. His arms would tighten around her, and she would feel the landscape of raised scars on his back, the legacy of the fire that had almost destroyed him. He would trace the faint scar on her cheek, a reminder of Beauregard's cruelty. They were the scars of both fire and snow, a testament to everything they had endured and everything they had overcome, together. In the final scene, late one evening, Mary walked out into the crisp, cold air to fetch another log for the fire. The first stars were beginning to appear in the deep purple sky. She had just picked up a heavy piece of pine when she felt his arms wrap around her from behind, his chin coming to rest on her shoulder. She leaned back against the solid warmth of his chest, a feeling of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. She turned her head, a playful smile on her lips, and looked at him. "You will freeze out here," she said, the words a soft, familiar echo. He pulled her closer, his lips brushing against her hair. She could feel the smile in his voice as he whispered back, his words a final, perfect promise against the vast, cold beauty of the night. "Not anymore. I have got you now." Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans of the West. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.